So I'm going to talk about diplomacy in the digital age. And you might have woken up this morning and thought, my God, this world is becoming a more conflictual and more dangerous place than ever before. And it does seem to be the case that we have a world order that's being driven by rising and declining powers, climate change, hunger, terrorism. And so you might ask yourself, who's in charge? And there's a good reason why the UN and thus the world leaders chose a particular goal as part of their Sustainable Development Goals for 2030. Because they did choose peace and stable institutions. And they did so for a very good reason. Because behind those words lie what has delivered, at least in parts of the globe, the longest period of peace that we've ever seen before. And that peace hasn't come just by accident. It has been produced by what we call diplomacy, or the peaceful conversation between states. Adam Watson, a scholar and also a diplomat, coined this particular way of understanding diplomacy because he wanted to stress that you could only have peace because states were in dialogue, in constant conversation about how to solve problems. If you now look at news and say, well, there's only conflict, then that might be partly true and partly wrong. But one of the major issues that's challenging the way we do diplomacy is the digital age. We've entered a period in history that is transforming the way states negotiate. And now any periodization of time is of course problematic. So you might say, well, the information age, isn't that a hype? But there is something profoundly interesting about the way in which negotiations take place today. And that's what I'm going to focus on. Now, diplomacy rests on three pillars. And the first pillar, traditionally at least, is time. And you might say, why time? Because time is crucial to mature a negotiation process. You simply need time to get to the point of agreement. The second pillar of diplomacy over hundreds of years has been a space, a confidential room where you can try out different ideas and find out where the compromise really lies, where the red lines are. And that's why you sometimes need to fly the warring parties out of the conflict zone and into a totally different area, closed out from far away from the public and from media, to find those difficult compromises. Think of the Dayton Agreement that ended the war in Yugoslavia. You had to fly Milosevic and the other leaders outside, long away, to Ohio, Dayton, a small city in the US, to find that peace that ended the big war in Yugoslavia. So that's space. And the final pillar of diplomacy is tact. That's also another name for politeness. Basically, the ability to be able to talk even though you disagree, to be agreeable while still disagreeing. And that is also known as protocol. It's a particular language used by diplomats to help save the face of the other. Now, all three pillars of diplomacy are trembling because we've entered this digital age. And I'll try to give you some examples of what that means and how we're going to study it, because it is crucial for how we might deliver on those goals we've set up for the world. So, of course, the public has always been important for diplomacy. The way in which agreements are seen or reached really matters for whether or not an agreement is successful. You need legitimacy. But it's also the case that there is a deep tension between confidentiality on the one hand and the public on the other. It's a basic problem of any political order to try to find that balance. Diplomacy has always been criticized for exactly those three pillars, especially the problem of confidentiality. And President Wilson, when he observed the First World War and saw what secret diplomacy can do in order to drive states that didn't really want to get into war, into a deep war, a world war, he thought the solution would have to be to open up diplomacy, to make it public and transparent. And that's when he published the famous 14 points that later became crucial to build up the multilateral world order we have today. He said, as one of his points, that he wanted open covenants of peace, after which there should be no private international understanding of any kind. Diplomacy shall always take place frankly and in the public view. Now, that's a great misunderstanding about what he wanted. It's not public all the time. What he wanted is that the negotiations, once they were conducted, that they would be free for the public to see, and so that everyone could evaluate them. But he didn't want the entire negotiation process to be open. But the Wilsonian dream, as it were, of open diplomacy, of a foreign policy that everyone could follow, was alive. And it kept on all the while diplomacy was building institutions that would bind states in new ways through public law, public international law throughout the last century. And then something happened. We had a new Wilsonian moment in world politics. At least the Wilsonian dream was born again when Bill Gates wrote in his book about what he thought the information highway, as he called it, would do. He hoped that the internet would help increase the understanding that citizens of one country have about their neighboring countries, and thereby reduce international tensions. It was a very positive dream. It was a dream of the 90s that said that the digital revolution would basically help create mutual understanding. Now, unfortunately, that didn't really happen. We have seen a digital revolution. We have seen a wave of openness in diplomacy as leaders now use their smartphones during negotiations and give us insights into what they do 24/7 in a news cycle that is putting attention on every single piece of legislation. But it has done more than that. It has created what Professor Thompson from the University of Cambridge has called a despatialized visibility. That is, it has created this form of intimate self-presentation free from the constraints of co-presence. So basically it means we can be in two different rooms across the globe and still feel that we're almost in the same room. It has brought us closer together, but it also created a whole new kind of entanglement between the public and the private, between confidentiality and transparency. And when did this start, really? Well, just 2 decades ago, it was unthinkable that you could access the engine room of a confidential negotiation as a normal citizen. But this is now possible. And one of the first leaders who really took this on board was President Obama during his election campaign. And he used Twitter strategically, together with his team, to get elected, but also to handle foreign policy issues. And at the beginning, nobody really wanted this. It was seen as a hype, as something that would never really materialize and do something. But very soon, almost every single leader across the world, whether they're dictators or Democrats, liberals or Republicans, they all use social media. And this is a fundamental change in the way diplomacy works. Because what happens when they use their smartphones? Has social media become a lethal weapon? Basically, we're faced with two unknowns. On the one hand, we have the confidential negotiations leading to peace agreements and trade agreements to which we seldom have access. It's kind of a black box. And on the other hand, we have the information revolution, which creates millions of tweets and updates on social media, data points that we still don't know how to interpret. So we want to bring these two unknowns together to fully understand what digital diplomacy means. And to do that, my ambition is to create a new theory, a theory of what I call diplomatic facework, which basically deals with the entanglement between confidential negotiations and the public display of these negotiations. And to do that, I borrow insights from this sociologist, the Canadian-American Erving Goffman, who in the 60s and 70s wrote about what it means to be a human. He wrote about the micro-interactions we have to help handle shame when we have a disability, blind or a handicap. How do we handle that when we get on a bus? And how do the other people in a bus handle that? That's just one example of how the microsociology of Erving Goffman has helped shape ways in which we think about public and private, backstage and front stage, and how we seem to appear or manage our impressions or face vis-a-vis each other. Now, he created that theory of face work for micro-interactions in a village or in a family. And I want to take that theory and apply it to the world of diplomacy. And that's because what goes on when you have states and state leaders on social media, you have a situation of very complicated face work that takes place both backstage and front stage. And I define this kind of face work as the activity of creating and maintaining an image of the national self. It's basically about how you project yourself as a country. So one example of how the digital revolution challenges the three pillars of diplomacy is this. So this is Donald Tusk, the head of the European Council, who puts this on his Instagram profile. And it's an image showing Theresa May, the British Prime Minister, and himself, Donald Tusk, in front of a cake buffet. And he then writes, "A piece of cake, perhaps? Sorry, no cherries," alluding to the fact that the EU doesn't want the UK to do any cherry picking during the negotiations leading to the exit of the United Kingdom of the EU, one of the major negotiations taking place inside the EU at this stage. And he also wants to allude to this idea of having its cake and eat it too, the idea that the UK wants it all without membership. All this is seen, at least from the perspective of Donald Tusk, as humorous, slightly sort of soft touch on negotiations that are really dramatic. But in the United Kingdom, this image is seen as a sign that the United Kingdom is being humiliated during these negotiations, that Theresa May is very weak, and that Donald Tusk is basically hostile to British interests. Another example of how the digital enters relations between states is this. This is an update from the Pakistani defense minister, who wakes up one morning and sees a piece of news that Israel is threatening his country with nuclear war. And so he wants to rush to Twitter to explain that, hey, Pakistan is a nuclear power too. So these are two countries that are apparently threatening each other on Twitter with nuclear war. Just think about that. But had the Pakistani minister just double-checked the news, he would have seen that actually this piece of information was entirely constructed. It was a fake piece of information. And the Israeli minister rushes to explain that this is not true. Israel is not threatening Pakistan. But at this point, the tweet from the Pakistani defense minister has already been spread and consumed across the globe. So social media does really fundamentally change the way states relate to each other. And this is also one example of what we call digital disinformation, which has entered the very engine room of diplomacy. And the consequences may be so dramatic that the three pillars of diplomacy are trembling to such an extent that diplomacy may no longer deliver on those goals and create that kind of peaceful relation that it has hitherto created. So the ultimate ambition of my research is to try to understand not just the mechanisms that are driving these relations between the confidential and the public, but also whether it's possible in the future to design institutions, maybe a new pillar of diplomacy that is apt to function in the digital age.